Does today's vote mean the Bloc is more likely to try to topple the Trudeau government? The Bloc's Deputy House Leader, Christine Normandin, is with us now. Hi, Madame Normandin. Pleasure to welcome you to our program. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
I just spoke with the government House Leader, Minister Gould, and she did not unequivocally say no to the proposition. She maintains that her opposition and the federal cabinet's opposition today to your motion was about setting a precedent, not necessarily opposing the boost to OAS. Is that your understanding as well? Is your sense that the government is still open to that proposition?
Well, I won't put words in her mouth. That's what has been mentioned to us, that it was more of a procedural thing rather than saying no on the basics, on the grounds of our demand today. So yes, the window seems to be closing, though, on our demands, but it's not completely shut. So we still hope that we can use the next few days to make the gains that we are aimed at. So the fact that they didn't say total no today to our demand still gives us hope, but the time is running, though, and that's something that we have to remember. It takes maybe, 48 hours to get the royal recommendation, but if we get it on October 28th, it would be too much at the end of our ultimatum, and if we see that in the next few days or so, there's no going further with a royal recommendation, then we might take our ultimatum a bit faster and start having discussions with other parties, seeing that it would become impossible for our bill to pass prior to the deadline that we have set.
So would I be accurate to interpret that this week is kind of do or die time in the Bloc's view?
Yes, kind of. We can see it day by day, and there will still be discussions, but we won't be unnecessarily patient. We'll see with what will be put on the table if there's still a chance that our bill passes. And as soon as we see, well, there's no chance, we'll start to have the discussions we'll need to have with other parties, as we mentioned we would. So there's no surprise on our side. It's all up to the government to decide. And there's still a message that was sent today. The House voted in majority in order for the government to grant the royal recommendation to the bill. So that's something positive that came out of it. And the fact that the government was specifically asked on their position on the royal recommendation, and they didn't just say a solid no is positive, but time really seems to be running a bit faster now.
And I do have questions about the proposition itself. I just want to ask one more kind of technicality. When you talk about what happens if the deadline that the Bloc has set comes to pass, or even in advance of that, Mr. Blanchet has mentioned talking with other opposition parties. Does the Bloc feel that it will be able to force an election should that be necessary? Because I think that the government's sense is that they would still be able to lean, for example, on New Democrats in order to stay in power.
Well, there's plenty of things that we don't control. What we mentioned we would do was to start having discussions on how to topple the government, but we cannot promise to topple the government because it needs discussions with other parties, and other things can happen in the meanwhile as well. The government could decide to go for prorogation or to call for an election itself. So there's plenty of things that could still happen that we don't have control over. What we mentioned we would do was to start having discussions, and that's exactly what we'll do as soon as we see that our bills won't make it before the deadline of October 29th. So that's what we said we would do. That's what we'll do.
On the idea of expanding the boost to OAS to Canadians between 65 and 74, the primary concern, at least it seemed this morning, raised by cabinet ministers and different Liberal MPs as they headed into caucus was around the cost. The parliamentary budget officer has identified it at somewhere in and around $3 billion a year. And as that demographic grows or that age group grows, then the cost associated would as well. What is your response to those concerns? Essentially, the idea that they're putting forward is it would not be fair to younger generations to saddle them, with more government debt, but also to take limited resources away from programs that might help them and their financial situation, and direct it to seniors who data would bear out are actually in not a great position, but a better position than younger demographics.
Well, two things. As I mentioned earlier, the bill has already passed second reading and got unanimous consent in committee, so there's a general agreement on the grounds of the bill. But I find it a bit rich from the Liberals to talk about intergenerational inequity. We're not taking money out of the younger generation's pockets to support our bill. And when you think about it, what we're asking for is 0.57% of the budget. What is a burden on the youngster is the deficit, and what does cause that deficit is the money that is sent to oil and gas industry, which don't need it as they made record profits in the past years. And it's money that's used to destroy the planet that the younger generation will inherit. So they're kind of paying twice because of those gifts the government are giving the oil industries. So we're basically just asking the government to take some of that money from the pockets of the oil industry and put it back in the seniors' pockets. So I find it rich when it comes from the government and government representatives that our bill would cause intergenerational inequity.
So from what I can ascertain, the money that goes to oil and gas companies is primarily in the form of a tax credit aimed at incentivizing carbon capture, in essence, to help the sector reduce its emission, which is in line, I think, overall. Not the money going there, but the idea of reducing carbon emissions with what the Bloc would hope to see. You don't want the government to incentivize that. You want to take that money and instead direct it at boosting OAS?
When it comes to carbon capture and stuff like that, I think the money should go to other companies than the oil company. There's no such thing as green oil, and generally the companies use the fact that they decarbonize oil just in order to produce more. And we've seen the levels of production going up. So if we want to phase out oil and we just label it green, it makes no sense. So if the money is used that way, we don't see the real incentive in diminishing the consumption of oil, which should be the real target. And other companies, startups, and there's plenty in Quebec, could use that money better as incentives to create, innovate in order to capture carbon. And that money doesn't have to go in the pockets of who, like I've already mentioned, make billions in profit already.
Yeah, and just final question. I have asked the government and provincial governments, by the way, which also offer those credits, the same question, right, on multiple occasions. And the response is often, look, this is actually incentivizing something that we want them to do. And they are putting forward a lot of capital to match the tax credit as well. Again, it's not about diminishing those or capturing those emissions at the moment, but over the medium to long term as these really capital intensive projects are built. Is it truly in the best interest of the company to take away that to take away that incentive and direct it to the priority you outline? Or is it possible we just can't afford to do both?
Well, if we come back to your earlier question with regards to intergeneral inequity, well, now we're talking about equity between oil companies and the senior. I think it's a rather easy choice on our part, considering that the companies make profits that the seniors don't. Just that to start with is an answer in itself for me.
Okay, Madame Normandin, I will leave it on that note. Thank you very much for making the time as always. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me once again.